Family, the first sin ever committed was not in the Garden of Eden.
All right, let's see it.
The first sin ever committed happened in heaven. So the scripture teaches us, since we don't read, that God created all these angelic beings. And among those angelic beings, he created 3 archangels. Michael, who's responsible for warfare. Gabriel, who's responsible for delivering messages. Lucifer, who was responsible for worship.
None of this is in the Bible. These are traditions that were developed in non-biblical Greco-Roman period Jewish literature and then within the literature of early Judaism and early Christianity. They are then read back into the Bible, and so passages that seem like they could have something to do with these traditions are interpreted through the lenses provided by those non-biblical traditions.
The scripture says his body was made out of musical instruments and pipes. Ezekiel taught us that.
Ezekiel says absolutely no such thing whatsoever. This is a misunderstanding of Ezekiel 28, which is not about Satan or about Lucifer, who is not identified as Satan until after the Bible was complete. This is entirely about the human prince of Tyre. And in verse 13, we have these references to precious stones. And then in the King James Version, it talks about musical instruments and pipes. But this is very obscure Hebrew, and most scholars these days agree that these words are actually references to sockets and settings and mounts and things like that. So it is symbolically talking about the creation of a human.
But then Isaiah in 14 teaches us something about Lucifer when he was in heaven.
So Isaiah 14 has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with any entity named Satan. It is a sarcastic reference to the human king of Babylon, and because of his hubris, it is sarcastically referring to him as if he was some deity named Halel ben Shachar, which would mean Shining One, Son of the Dawn, which is almost certainly a reference to a deity associated with the planet Venus. It's not actually saying the king of Babylon is that deity. It's just sarcastically suggesting he is identified with that deity. And then when that gets translated into Greek for the Septuagint, it gets translated as Heosphoros, which would be the light bringer or the dawn bringer, and then that gets translated into Latin for the Vulgate as Lucifer, and that's where we get the notion that this is the name of an individual. This is not referring to any entity named Satan. This is just a sarcastic reference to the human king of Babylon.
Some way, somehow, he got a glimpse of his beauty. And then the first sin entered into the heart of a being, pride. And then in his pride, the scripture says, because of your much trading, you corrupted yourself.
So we're back to Ezekiel 28, which is condemning the Prince of Tyre for their pride as a result of the success of their commerce. Even within this post-biblical tradition of Lucifer becoming prideful and falling because of that pride, it is not because Lucifer was successful in trade or commerce or industry. So this is not making sense of what is actually in the biblical text. This is trying to force a post-biblical unifying framework onto the Bible, and it's not really working.
And he goes on whispering in the ears of all these angels that he's going to be better than God. And then the second sin is born in his heart, rebellion. And the scripture teaches us he rebelled against God, and there was war in heaven. Read the book, War in Heaven.
So now we're talking about Revelation 12:7, which is eschatological. This is something that takes place after Jesus' ministry. This has nothing to do with anything that went on before the creation of Adam and Eve.
The scripture says because of that, watch, Satan was cast out of heaven. It's when Jesus said, I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning down to the earth. And in Revelation, when he's pictured as the dragon, it says his tail took a third of the stars of heaven with him.
So now we're talking about Luke 10:18, and while there are folks out there who imagine that this is interpreting Isaiah 14:12 as a reference to Satan, it is far more likely evoking Enochic imagery, and specifically the animal apocalypse, which starts with Enoch saying, I saw a star fall from heaven, and then it brings down other stars of heaven to earth to be with it. So that's almost certainly the antecedent of what's going on in Luke 10:18.
That is, he took 1/3 of all of the angels with him who he had gotten their ear. So stupid. who, according to Jude, abandoned their place in heaven, and now they're going to be chained in eternal fire for their abandonment of God.
So Jude is quite explicitly referring to the Enochic tradition, specifically the narrative that we find in the book of 1st Enoch, where the head malevolent angel convinces 200 other angels to enter into a covenant and descend with him upon Mount Hermon and have children with human women. So this is quite explicitly referring back to and evoking non-biblical Greco-Roman period Jewish literature.
These angels that he corrupted, that was thrown out of heaven, are the demons that roam the earth today.
So this isn't in the Bible, and this is actually a misunderstanding of the narrative in 1st Enoch, because it is not the angels who came down to earth to have children with human women who are the demons that roam around the earth and that possess humans. See, the angels had children with human women. Those children were the giants who gave birth to the Nephilim, and then when the Nephilim died, it was their spirits that became the unseen demons that roam around the earth and possess humans. So this is just renegotiating the renegotiation of earlier renegotiations of what is basically fan fiction of the Bible, which itself is negotiating with earlier traditions.
That's why I'm going to keep encouraging you. Don't just listen to me. Read the scriptures for yourself.
Of course, these folks don't want you to read the Bible for yourself. They want you to read it for yourself in light of the interpretive lenses that they're providing. Because if you read it for yourself independent of the interpretive lenses that are being endorsed in a sermon like this, you're going to find that the Bible doesn't really say these things. You can't arrive at these conclusions unless you import those unifying frameworks that were developed outside of and after the Bible. They're not asking you to read the Bible for yourself. They're asking you to read the Bible for yourself as long as you remain subordinated to the interpretive lenses that they give you. And one final interesting thing to note here is that when it comes to the problem of evil and where evil comes from, you actually had two competing narratives in the ancient world, because the story of the Garden of Eden with the serpent bringing sin and therefore death into the world is a post-biblical interpretation. The earlier interpretation is actually the one provided in the non-biblical book of Enoch, where it was the angels descending to earth who delivered knowledge of evil and wickedness to humanity after they had already been created. And there was tension between these two explanations of where evil came from. And while the Enochic tradition was earlier, it was the later serpent in the Garden of Eden reading that took priority. And what this sermon is doing is actually kind of wedding the two and trying to harmonize them to create a third hybrid notion of evil starting before the creation of the earth and humanity, but also then being realized in the Garden of Eden after the creation of the earth and humanity. So this is just negotiating with other negotiations to try to arrive at something that makes the text more meaningful and useful to this particular community of believers. And the fit for this video has been Superman, Batman, and Robin.